threat. Sirens sounded immediately in Israel. War is political, and this is a war of choice aimed at changing the regime in Iran. Iran tried to deliver on its threat of a devastating response aimed at the extensive network of U.S. bases in the Gulf. This was Qatar, as well as Israel.
Go, go! Get inside.
In Dubai, tourists looking for winter sun had a nasty reminder of the region's realities. Close by in Bahrain, this appears to be a strike aimed at the big U.S. naval base. Iran says it will use more powerful missiles than the ones it fired in last summer's war. An interceptor rocket went up. Iran will hope that as the days pass, the U.S. and Israel will start running out of defensive missiles. In Tehran, regime supporters rallied around the flag. It would take more than killing the supreme leader to destroy the regime. It has a complex political system underpinned by ideology, corruption, and the ruthless use of force against dissent. In January, big protests against threat.
We're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. So what are our options? In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with the greengrocer. Every morning, the shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. For decades. For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals. And we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
Breaking news. This didn't start as a trade dispute. It started as an accusation so bold, so calculated, that within hours it began shaking one of the closest alliances in the modern world. The United States has officially launched a forced labor investigation into Canada. Let that sink in. Not China, not a sanctioned state, Canada. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now, enjoy the video. And what happened next is what nobody in Washington expected. Mark Carney didn't respond quietly. He didn't go behind closed doors. He stepped forward, and what he said, quote, and what he's now doing, could turn this into the most explosive USC confrontation in decades. Stay with me, because the deeper you go into this story, the clearer it becomes. This is not about labor. This is about power, control, and a strategy that could reshape North American trade in real time. Now, let's set the stage, because the timeline here matters more than anything. 72 hours ago, the U.S. Commerce Department initiated a formal probe under Section 307 of the Tariff Act. The target? Canadian aluminum, softwood lumber, and agricultural imports. The justification? Potential links to forced labor practices. On paper, that sounds procedural. It sounds like routine enforcement, but the moment you scratch beneath the surface, the entire narrative starts to unravel. Canada is not a country known for labor exploitation scandals. In fact, by most international benchmarks, Canada ranks higher than the United States in worker protections, union strength, and wage standards. So why Canada? Why now? Here's where things start to get uncomfortable. This investigation didn't come out of nowhere. It followed weeks of escalating rhetoric from Donald Trump, who has repeatedly framed Canada as an economic threat in recent rallies. He didn't just mention trade imbalances. He went further. He suggested that Canadian industries were undercutting American workers using what he called questionable labor practices. That phrase matters because 2 weeks later, officials in his administration began echoing it. Then came reports of internal discussions about supply chain integrity checks targeting Canadian imports. And now we have a full-scale investigation built on that exact foundation. But here's the part that changes everything. According to multiple sources familiar with internal trade discussions, this probe may not be about proving forced labor at all. It may be about creating enough uncertainty to disrupt Canadian exports at a critical moment, right before the 2026 review of the USMCA trade agreement. Think about the timing. Canadian aluminum producers rely heavily on American buyers. Softwood lumber is deeply integrated into U.S. housing markets. Agriculture flows back and forth across the border every single day. You don't need to prove wrongdoing to cause damage. You just need to raise the question. Because once that question exists, buyers hesitate, orders get delayed, contracts get reconsidered, supply chains start shifting. The impact begins long before an official finding is made. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. Within 48 hours of the announcement, Canadian exporters began reporting hesitation from U.S. partners. Some orders were paused, others were quietly redirected. Millions of dollars in trade activity didn't stop completely, it just slowed enough to create pressure. And pressure in trade politics is everything, because it forces the other side to react. It forces them into a position where doing nothing looks like weakness. But here's where Washington miscalculated. They expected a measured response, a diplomatic statement, quiet negotiations. That's how previous Canadian leaders handled trade tensions. Careful, controlled, behind the scenes. But this time, the response was different. This time, the response came from Mark Carney, and within hours, he changed the tone of the entire situation. Carney didn't just reject the accusations, he reframed them. In a statement that spread across international media within minutes, he accused the United States of weaponizing human rights language for economic advantage. He didn't soften the message, he didn't dilute it, he called it exactly what he believes it is, a politically motivated move designed to justify trade restrictions under the cover of moral concern. And then he did something even more strategic. He turned the argument back on the United States itself. Because here's the reality that makes this situation so volatile. The United States operates a prison labor system that under its own constitution allows incarcerated individuals to work for extremely low wages. That's not an opinion, that's policy. And Carney used that fact as leverage, not as a rhetorical jab, but as a legal counterpoint. If the U.S. is opening the door to forced labor scrutiny, then Canada can walk through that same door and examine American imports under the same lens. That's when this stopped being a one-sided investigation and started becoming a potential trade war. And now the situation is entering a new phase, because behind the statements, behind the headlines, both sides are already preparing their next moves. Legal teams are mobilizing, trade officials are calculating scenarios, industries on both sides of the border are bracing for impact. And the most important detail? None of this has officially escalated yet. No tariffs have been implemented, no final rulings have been made. Everything you're seeing right now is happening in the space before the explosion, which means the real question isn't what has happened. The real question is what happens next. Now, here's where the situation stops being just political theater and starts becoming something much more calculated. Because what Mark Carney did next wasn't just a response, it was a counterstrike designed to hit the United States exactly where it didn't expect to be challenged. Within hours of the U.S. announcement, Carney authorized Canada to begin preparing its own investigation into American imports. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, a real, legal, structured probe targeting American agricultural goods. And the focus? Whether products entering Canada have any connection to prison labor systems inside the United States. Let that sink in for a second. The exact same legal framework Washington used against Canada is now being mirrored back at Washington. This changes the entire dynamic, because the United States didn't just open an investigation, it opened a precedent. And once that precedent exists, it can be used both ways. Here's why that matters. The American prison labor system is not hidden, it's documented. Over 800,000 incarcerated individuals participate in work programs across various industries. In some cases, they produce goods that enter commercial supply chains. Now, the moment Canada starts asking whether any of those goods are crossing into its market, the conversation shifts instantly. It's no longer about allegations, it becomes about verifiable exposure. It becomes about evidence. And this is where the strategy becomes clear. Carney isn't trying to win a press cycle. He's trying to force the United States into a position where continuing the investigation against Canada becomes politically and legally uncomfortable. Because if Washington pushes forward, it risks inviting the same scrutiny onto its own system at an international level. But the counterattack doesn't stop there. At the same time, Canada is preparing to trigger a formal dispute under the USMCA agreement. This is not a minor step. This is a structured legal process that can escalate into authorized countermeasures. If Canada files under Chapter 31, it sets in motion a panel review that could determine whether the U.S. investigation violates the terms of the trade agreement. And here's the critical detail. If Canada wins that case, it gains the legal right to impose tariffs in response. We're talking about targeted economic retaliation. American steel, American vehicles, agricultural exports, entire sectors that depend on Canadian markets could suddenly face new barriers. And unlike a political reaction, these measures would carry legal protection under the very agreement the United States negotiated. Now think about the pressure building behind the scenes. American farmers rely on Canada as one of their largest export markets. Billions of dollars of goods move north every year. The auto industry is even more fragile. Supply chains between the two countries are so deeply integrated that a single part can cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Disrupt that flow even slightly, and the ripple effects multiply fast. This is why, behind closed doors, business leaders in the United States are already reacting, quietly but urgently, because they understand something the political narrative often ignores. Trade wars don't stay contained, they spread. They hit industries that were never part of the original dispute. And once supply chains start shifting, reversing that damage becomes very difficult. But here's where the tension becomes even more intense, because while economic signals are flashing warning signs everywhere, the political messaging is doing the exact opposite. For Donald Trump, this situation reinforces a narrative that has been building for months: the idea that foreign countries, even close allies, are taking advantage of the United States, that American workers are being undercut, that aggressive action is necessary to level the playing field. And when that message reaches voters, it doesn't come with economic models or supply chain data.